The radio crackled with static, then silence. Captain Rodriguez pressed his back against the concrete barrier, feeling the percussion of incoming mortars shake dust from his helmet. His squad of 12 Marines had been pinned down for 47 minutes in what was supposed to be a routine patrol through the abandoned industrial district. The enemy had turned the maze of warehouses into a kill zone, and now his men were bleeding. Viper 6, this is Ground Team Alpha, Rodriguez spoke into his headset, voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. We need immediate air support. Grid coordinates follow. He rattled off the numbers while bullets sparked off metal sheeting above their heads. The response came back through layers of static and bureaucratic indifference that made his jaw clench. Ground Team Alpha, Viper 6, negative on air support. Closest assets are 40 minutes out, and we've got priority targets in Sector 7. Hold your position and await ground reinforcements. 40 minutes. Rodriguez closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the labored breathing of Corporal Martinez beside him. The kid had taken shrapnel to his shoulder and was losing blood faster than their medic could manage. Around the perimeter, his Marines were running low on ammunition, their suppressive fire becoming more sporadic with each passing minute. The enemy knew it too, their advance was getting bolder, more coordinated. The industrial complex stretched out like a concrete graveyard under the harsh afternoon sun. Smoke columns rose from burning fuel drums, creating an apocalyptic skyline that seemed to mock their predicament. This wasn't how Rodriguez had imagined his first deployment as squad leader would go. 6 months of planning, intelligence briefings, and tactical rehearsals, all rendered useless by an enemy that refused to follow the script. Contact right, Sergeant Williams called out, his rifle already spitting controlled bursts toward a warehouse window where muzzle flashes had appeared. The sound of automatic weapons fire filled the air like deadly thunder, punctuated by the whine of ricochets and the occasional scream of wounded men. Rodriguez felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every decision could mean life or death for his Marines. Then something changed in the sky above them. It started as a distant hum, barely audible over the gunfire. Rodriguez looked up, squinting against the glare of the sun, expecting to see nothing but empty blue. Instead, there was a speck growing larger by the second. The sound grew deeper, more distinctive, the unmistakable growl of turbofan engines that every grunt learned to recognize. But it couldn't be right. Air support was 40 minutes away. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't have existed according to every briefing and tactical assessment they'd received. The speck resolved into a silhouette that made Rodriguez's heart skip a beat. Major Lydia Ghost, Nakamura had been flying combat missions for 8 years, but today felt different from the moment she strapped into the cockpit of her Thunderbolt II. The pre-flight checklist had become second nature: hydraulics, electrical systems, weapon status. Yet her hands moved with unusual deliberation. Something in the morning briefing had bothered her, a nagging sense that the intelligence reports weren't telling the whole story about enemy movement in the industrial sector. She'd earned her call sign Ghost during her second deployment, when she'd managed to provide close air support to a surrounded reconnaissance team without the enemy ever detecting her approach. The name stuck, partly because of her ability to appear when least expected, and partly because of how she seemed to vanish from conversations whenever the topic turned to her past. Most pilots assumed it was typical military reserve, but the truth was more complicated. Nakamura had grown up in a family where military service was tradition, not choice. Her grandfather had flown P-51 Mustangs in World War II. Her father had piloted F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, and her older brother had died in an F-16 over Afghanistan 3 years before she'd even entered flight school. The weight of that legacy sat in her chest like a stone, driving her to excel while simultaneously making every mission feel like a test she couldn't afford to fail. The A-10 was not a glamorous aircraft. While other pilots flew sleek fighters that broke the sound barrier, she piloted what looked like a flying tank, ugly, slow, and built around a cannon that could destroy anything unlucky enough to find itself in its crosshairs. The Warthog, as it was affectionately known, was designed for one purpose: keeping ground troops alive. It was a philosophy that matched Nakamura's own approach to combat aviation. Today's mission had started as routine combat air patrol, but 20 minutes into her flight, she'd intercepted radio chatter that made her deviate from her planned route. Ground Team Alpha was in trouble, requesting immediate air support, and being told that none was available. Standard procedure would have been to relay the information up the chain of command and continue with her assigned patrol. But Nakamura had never been one to follow standard procedure when lives were at stake. She banked her aircraft toward the industrial complex, knowing that what she was about to do could end her career. Unauthorized deviation from assigned mission parameters was a court-martial offense, especially when it involved engaging targets without proper clearance. But as she listened to the increasingly desperate radio calls from the Marines below, career consideration seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. The Warthog's engines growled as she pushed the throttles forward, descending toward a battle that officially didn't exist. The first thing Rodriguez noticed was the distinctive silhouette: twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, straight wings, and that unmistakable nose that housed the A-10 Avenger cannon. An A-10 Thunderbolt II, known to every ground soldier as the Warthog, and more importantly as Salvation with Wings. But this couldn't be right. His request for air support had been denied. This aircraft wasn't supposed to be here. "Unknown aircraft, this is Ground Team Alpha," Rodriguez spoke into his radio, trying to keep the hope out of his voice. "Are you responding to our request for close air support?" The response came back in a voice that was calm, professional, and unmistakably female. "Ground Team Alpha, this is Ghost. I was in the neighborhood. Heard you might need some help." In the neighborhood, Rodriguez almost smiled despite their desperate situation. In military parlance, that usually meant someone had decided to bend or break a few rules to be where they needed to be. He'd never been more grateful for military insubordination in his life. "Ghost, we've got multiple enemy positions in buildings surrounding our location. We're pinned down and taking casualties. Request immediate close air support on targets of opportunity." "Copy that, Alpha. I'm going to need you to pop smoke on your position and give me a running commentary on enemy locations. Stay low and keep your heads down. This might get loud." Rodriguez grabbed a smoke grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and tossed it into the middle of their defensive position. Green smoke began billowing up, creating a clear marker for the pilot above. Around him, his Marines pressed themselves deeper into cover, knowing that when an A-10 opened fire, the distinction between friend and foe often came down to a matter of meters. The Warthog made its first pass at what seemed like an impossibly low altitude, the pilot clearly surveying the battlefield and identifying targets. The aircraft was close enough that Rodriguez could see details: scorch marks on the fuselage from previous missions, the shark teeth painted around the nose, the way the landing gear housings gave it an awkward, predatory appearance. It was beautiful in the way that only a purpose-built war machine could be. "Alpha, I've got eyes on multiple muzzle flashes from the warehouse complex to your north. Going hot." The A-10 banked sharply and began its attack run. What happened next would be burned into Rodriguez's memory for the rest of his life. The sound came first, a deep, mechanical growl like some ancient dragon clearing its throat. Then the visual, a stream of depleted uranium rounds pouring from the Warthog's nose, each round the size of a beer bottle and traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound. The targeted warehouse simply disintegrated. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was unlike any other aircraft weapon system ever built. Capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute, it had been designed specifically to destroy Soviet tanks, but its effectiveness against fortified positions was equally devastating. Each depleted uranium round could penetrate several inches of steel, and when hundreds of them struck a concrete building in the span of 2 seconds, the results were apocalyptic. Nakamura felt the familiar vibration through her flight stick as the cannon fired, the entire aircraft shuddering under the recoil. She'd made this attack run hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in combat, but it never got old. The A-10 had been built around this weapon, every other system designed to support and enhance the effectiveness of that 7-barrel rotary cannon. She pulled up from her dive, banking hard to the left to set up for her next pass. Below, she could see the smoke clearing from her first target. Where a 3-story warehouse had stood moments before, there was now mostly rubble and silence. The enemy fire from that position had ceased completely. "Ghost, this is Alpha," came the voice over her radio. "That was a direct hit. Enemy fire from the north warehouse has stopped. We've got movement in the building complex to our east now." Nakamura adjusted her heading, already identifying her next target. Through her heads-up display, she could see muzzle flashes coming from windows in a long, low building that looked like it had once been a factory. The Marines were still pinned down, but at least now they had room to maneuver. "Alpha, I see the target. You might want to get comfortable down there. I'm going to work that building over pretty thoroughly." She lined up for her second attack run, nodding with satisfaction that her fuel levels were still good, and her ammunition counter showed plenty of rounds remaining. This was what she trained for, what the A-10 had been designed for: close air support in danger-close situations where precision and overwhelming firepower were the difference between life and death for ground forces. The Warthog dove toward its second target, and once again, the sky filled with the sound of mechanical thunder. This time, Nakamura walked her fire along the entire length of the building, systematically destroying each potential fighting position. Glass exploded outward in glittering cascades, concrete walls crumbled under the impact of depleted uranium rounds, and what had been a coordinated enemy strongpoint became a smoking ruin in less than 10 seconds. "Alpha, this is Ghost. How's your situation looking now?" Rodriguez couldn't believe what he was seeing. In the span of 3 minutes, this mystery pilot had eliminated 2 major enemy positions that had been keeping his squad pinned down for nearly an hour. His Marines were already beginning to move, taking advantage of the lull in enemy fire to reposition and tend to their wounded. The change in battlefield dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Enemy forces that had been advancing with confidence were now scrambling for cover, their coordinated assault dissolving into confused retreat. The psychological impact of close air support was often as important as the physical destruction. Few things demoralized an enemy faster than watching their positions get systematically obliterated by aircraft they couldn't effectively engage. "Ghost Alpha, the pressure's definitely off. We can see enemy personnel withdrawing from the remaining buildings. Request you maintain overwatch while we consolidate our position and prepare to move our wounded." "Copy that, Alpha. I'll maintain a high orbit and keep an eye on things. Let me know if anyone tries to crash your party." Nakamura pulled her aircraft into a wide circle above the industrial complex, scanning for additional targets while keeping one eye on her fuel gauge. She had perhaps 20 minutes of loiter time before she'd need to return to base, but that should be enough to ensure the Marines could extract safely. As she flew her lazy orbit, she found herself thinking about the decision that had brought her here. Diverting from assigned patrol routes without authorization was a serious violation of military protocol. There would be questions, paperwork, and quite possibly disciplinary action. But as she listened to the Marines below coordinating their movement and caring for their wounded, she knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing and following orders weren't the same thing. Today had been one of those times. Below, Rodriguez was coordinating the evacuation of his wounded while maintaining security on their perimeter. The enemy had definitely withdrawn, but that didn't mean they wouldn't regroup and attempt another assault. Having the A-10 overhead was like having a protective angel, an angel armed with a 30 cannon and an apparent willingness to use it on anyone who threatened his Marines. Ghost, this is Alpha. We're going to start moving toward our extraction point in 5 minutes. Can you provide cover during our movement? Absolutely, Alpha. I'll stay with you until you're clear of the danger area. Rodriguez allowed himself a moment of gratitude. He still didn't know who this pilot was or what had brought her to their position at exactly the right moment, but he made a mental note to find out. His Marines were alive because someone had decided to be in the right place at the right time. Rules and regulations be damned. As his squad began their tactical withdrawal, Rodriguez looked up at the circling warthog one more time. Sometimes salvation came from unexpected directions, wearing unexpected forms, and speaking with unexpected voices. Today it had sounded like a professional female pilot with ice water in her veins and the skills to back up her confidence. He didn't know it yet, but he just witnessed the beginning of a legend. The journey back to base was a study in contrasts for Nakamura. On one hand, she felt the satisfaction that came from a successful mission. Marines were alive who might not have been, and enemy forces had been neutralized with precision and effectiveness. On the other hand, she was acutely aware that she just committed what the military would consider a serious breach of protocol. As she flew through the clear afternoon sky, her radio crackled with routine traffic from other aircraft in the area. Normal patrol reports, weather updates, fuel status checks, the mundane communications that kept military aviation operating smoothly. None of it mentioned an unauthorized A-10 conducting close air support in the industrial sector. Yet, the debrief would come, she knew. Satellite surveillance, radar tracks, radio intercepts. The military had a dozen ways of tracking aircraft movements, and her deviation from assigned patrol routes wouldn't go unnoticed for long. The question wasn't whether she'd be called to account for her actions, but when and by whom. Nakamura's hands moved automatically through the procedures for approaching base airspace, requesting permission to land and running through her pre-landing checklist. After 8 years of flying combat missions, these routines had become as natural as breathing. But today, something felt different. Today felt like a turning point, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The airfield appeared ahead, a welcome sight of organized runways and familiar buildings. She could see other A-10s parked on the flight line, their ground crews performing maintenance and preparing for upcoming missions. It was a comforting sight, the organized chaos of a functioning airbase, where dozens of people worked around the clock to keep aircraft flying and missions successful. Tower, this is Ghost requesting permission to land. Ghost Tower, you're cleared for approach on runway 27. Welcome back. The landing was routine, but as Nakamura taxied toward her assigned parking spot, she noticed something unusual. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, her squadron commander, was standing on the flight line waiting for her. This wasn't normal protocol. Squadron commanders didn't typically meet pilots returning from routine patrol missions. She shut down her engines and began her post-flight procedures, but her mind was already racing ahead to the conversation she was about to have. Harrison was a good officer and a fair leader, but he was also a stickler for following proper procedures. If he was waiting for her on the flight line, it meant someone higher up the chain of command had already taken notice of her unauthorized deviation. Nakamura climbed down from her cockpit and began walking toward her squadron commander. Her helmet felt heavier than usual, and her flight suit seemed to stick to her skin despite the cool afternoon air. This was the moment of reckoning, when her decision to help those Marines would either be vindicated or condemned by the military bureaucracy she'd sworn to serve. Harrison's expression was unreadable as she approached. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Harrison had been commanding A-10 squadrons for 6 years, and in that time, he developed an intuitive sense for when one of his pilots was about to create complications for his command. Today, watching Major Nakamura walk across the tarmac with that particular combination of confidence and wariness, He knew his intuition had been correct. The call from base operations had come in 20 minutes earlier. Satellite surveillance had tracked an A-10 operating outside its assigned patrol area, conducting what appeared to be close air support operations in a sector where no such missions had been authorized. The aircraft's transponder identified it as belonging to Harrison's squadron, and the timing matched Major Nakamura's patrol schedule. Harrison respected Nakamura as both a pilot and an officer. Her flying skills were exceptional, her tactical judgment was sound, and her commitment to the mission was unquestionable. But she also had a reputation for independent thinking that sometimes put her at odds with standard operating procedures. Today appeared to be one of those times. "Major Nakamura," Harrison said as she approached. His voice was neutral, professional, giving nothing away about his thoughts or intentions. "Sir," she replied, coming to attention and rendering a crisp salute. "Walk with me," Harrison said, returning her salute and then gesturing toward the squadron building. "I think we need to have a conversation about your patrol route today." They walked in silence for several moments, their footsteps echoing off the concrete of the flight line. Around them, the normal business of an airbase continued, ground crews servicing aircraft, pilots walking to and from briefings, the distant sound of jet engines warming up for departure. It was a familiar environment that usually felt comfortable and secure to Nakamura, but today it seemed charged with tension. "Major," Harrison began as they reached his office, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Did you deviate from your assigned patrol route today to provide unauthorized close air support to ground forces?" Nakamura met his gaze steadily. She'd known this moment would come, and she'd already decided how she would handle it. "Yes, sir, I did." Harrison nodded, unsurprised by her honesty. "Can you explain your reasoning for making that decision?" "I intercepted radio communications indicating that Marines were pinned down and taking casualties. They had requested air support and been denied due to other priority missions. I assessed that I had the capability to provide assistance without compromising my primary patrol mission. You understand that operating outside assigned parameters without authorization is a serious violation of protocol." "Yes, sir, I do." Harrison studied her for a moment, then walked to his desk and picked up a folder. Harrison opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. The initial incident report was straightforward: unauthorized aircraft operation, deviation from assigned mission parameters, failure to obtain proper clearance before engaging targets. In military bureaucracy, these were serious infractions that could result in anything from formal reprimand to court-martial proceedings. But there was another document in the folder that complicated the situation considerably. A preliminary after-action report from Ground Team Alpha, praising the exceptional close air support provided by an A-10 pilot call sign Ghost, and crediting that pilot with saving the lives of multiple Marines. The report specifically mentioned the pilot's professionalism, tactical expertise, and courage in responding to their emergency situation. "Major," Harrison said, closing the folder and looking directly at Nakamura, "I've got a problem. On one hand, you clearly violated established protocols by conducting unauthorized operations outside your assigned patrol area. That's the kind of action that typically results in disciplinary proceedings and negative marks on an officer's record." Nakamura remained at attention, her expression neutral but attentive. "On the other hand," Harrison continued, "I've got a preliminary report from the Marines you assisted that suggests your actions saved American lives and successfully neutralized enemy threats. The Ground Team Alpha commander is specifically requesting that you be recognized for your actions." The office fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft operations outside. Nakamura waited, knowing that her career could swing in either direction based on how her squadron commander chose to handle this situation. "I'm curious about something, Major," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair. "What made you decide to divert from your patrol route? You've been flying combat missions for 8 years. You know the importance of following proper procedures. What was different about today?" Nakamura considered the question carefully before responding. "Sir, I've always believed that our primary mission is to support and protect ground forces. When I heard those Marines calling for help and being told that none was available, I had to make a choice. I could follow my assigned patrol route and let them handle the situation on their own, or I could be where I was needed most." "And you chose to be where you were needed most." "Yes, sir, I did." Harrison nodded slowly. "Major, I'm going to be honest with you. This situation is going to generate paperwork and questions from people higher up the chain of command than either of us. There will be an investigation, and you'll need to provide detailed justification for your actions." "I understand, sir." "However," Harrison continued, "I'm also going to recommend you for commendation for your actions in support of ground forces under enemy fire." Nakamura's carefully maintained neutral expression cracked slightly, showing surprise. "Sorry." Harrison smiled for the first time since their conversation began. "Major, sometimes doing the right thing and following proper procedures aren't the same thing. Today was one of those days." The investigation took 3 weeks to complete, during which time Nakamura continued flying her assigned missions, while military bureaucrats reviewed every aspect of her unauthorized deviation from patrol parameters. The process was thorough, methodical, and ultimately vindicated her decision to provide close air support to the embattled Marines. The key factor in the investigation's conclusion was the detailed testimony from Ground Team Alpha. Captain Rodriguez and his Marines provided comprehensive statements about their tactical situation, the effectiveness of the air support they received, and their assessment of the pilot's professionalism and skill. The medical report on Corporal Martinez, whose shoulder wound would have been fatal without the rapid battlefield evacuation made possible by the A-10's intervention, carried particular weight with the investigating officers. During the 3 weeks of investigation, word of the incident began to spread through informal military channels. Fighter pilots were notorious gossips, and the story of Ghost, appearing without warning to save a pinned-down Marine squad, became the kind of tale that grew with each retelling. Some versions focused on the technical aspects, the precision of the cannon runs, the tactical assessment of enemy positions, the textbook close air support procedures. Others emphasized the human elements, the calm voice on the radio, the willingness to risk career consequences for the lives of ground troops, the sudden appearance of salvation when all seemed lost. Nakamura tried to stay focused on her regular duties during this period, but she couldn't ignore the subtle changes in how other pilots and ground crew treated her. There were more nods of acknowledgement, more invitations to join informal conversations, more requests for her input on tactical discussions. She was acquiring something that couldn't be earned through official channels, a genuine respect from her peers. The final investigation report was delivered to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison on a Tuesday morning in late September. The conclusions were nuanced but ultimately supportive of Nakamura's actions. While the report acknowledged that proper procedures had not been followed, it also recognized that the tactical situation had warranted immediate action, and that waiting for proper authorization would have resulted in American casualties. The formal recommendation was for a letter of commendation to be placed in Nakamura's personnel file, along with a notation that her actions had demonstrated exceptional initiative and commitment to the protection of ground forces under enemy fire. It was the kind of recognition that didn't come with medals or ceremonies, but that career military officers knew was worth more than public accolades. When Harrison called Nakamura into his office to discuss the investigation's conclusions, he found himself looking at an officer who seemed unchanged by the attention and controversy her actions had generated. "Major," he said, The investigation is complete, and I thought you'd like to know the results. Harrison's office felt different this time when Nakamura entered. The tension that had characterized their previous conversation was gone, replaced by something that felt more like professional camaraderie. The investigation had run its course, and whatever consequences were coming had already been determined. The investigating committee found that while you did deviate from established protocols, your actions were tactically sound and consistent with the overall mission of providing close air support to ground forces, Harrison explained, consulting the official report. You're receiving a letter of commendation, and there will be no negative notations in your personnel file. Nakamura nodded, maintaining her professional composure, but Harrison could see the relief in her eyes. There is one other thing, Major, Harrison continued. Word of your actions has reached some people pretty high up the chain of command. I've been asked to inform you that you're being considered for assignment to a new close air support development program. It would mean a promotion and the opportunity to help shape the future of how we provide air support to ground forces. This was unexpected news. Nakamura had assumed that her career would continue along its current trajectory, flying combat missions, gradually advancing in rank, eventually moving into staff or training positions. The opportunity to influence close air support doctrine and procedures hadn't been on her radar. Can you tell me more about the program, sir? It's still in the early stages, Harrison explained. But the basic concept is to develop more responsive and flexible close air support capabilities. The traditional model of pre-planned airstrikes and lengthy approval processes doesn't always match the reality of modern combat operations. Your actions 3 weeks ago are exactly the kind of initiative and tactical thinking they're looking to incorporate into formal doctrine. Harrison leaned forward in his chair. Major, I want you to understand something. What you did that day wasn't just good flying or good tactical thinking. It was leadership. You saw a situation where American lives were at stake, you had the capability to help, and you took action despite the potential consequences to your career. I was just doing my job, sir. No, Major. You were doing more than your job. You were demonstrating the kind of thinking and decision-making that the military needs more of. The ability to balance following orders with exercising independent judgment when circumstances require it. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering details about the potential new assignment and timeline for decision-making. But as Nakamura walked back to the flight line afterward, she found herself thinking less about career opportunities and more about that afternoon 3 weeks earlier when she'd heard the desperation in Captain Rodriguez's voice over the radio. She'd made her decision in that moment not because of career considerations or formal doctrine, but because Marines were in trouble and she had the ability to help them. Everything else, the investigation, the commendation, the potential promotion, was secondary to that fundamental truth. The transformation in how other pilots viewed Nakamura became apparent during the weekly squadron briefing the following Friday. Major Thompson, one of the more senior A-10 pilots and someone who had previously been somewhat dismissive of Nakamura's quietly professional approach, approached her after the briefing with a question about close air support tactics. "Ghost," Thompson said, using her call sign with a respect that hadn't been there before, "I wanted to get your opinion on something. We've got a mission coming up next week that involves potential close air support for a reconnaissance team. The row is pretty restrictive, but if things go sideways, we might need to provide immediate assistance." It was the kind of consultation that established pilots sought from each other when they wanted tactical advice from someone they trusted. The fact that Thompson was asking for her input represented a significant shift in squadron dynamics. Similar conversations began happening more frequently. Younger pilots started approaching Nakamura for advice about combat flying techniques. Ground crew members made a point of ensuring her aircraft received particularly careful attention during pre-flight inspections. Even pilots from other squadrons began nodding acknowledgments when their paths crossed on the flight line. The story of her unauthorized mission had become part of squadron folklore, but more than that, it had established her reputation as a pilot who could be counted on when situations became desperate. In military aviation, where trust and competence were matters of life and death, that kind of reputation was invaluable. Nakamura handled the increased attention with her characteristic quiet professionalism, neither seeking out the spotlight nor avoiding the responsibilities that came with her growing influence. She continued flying her assigned missions with the same methodical excellence she'd always displayed. But now, her radio calls were answered more quickly, and her tactical suggestions carried more weight in mission planning sessions. The most significant change came during a training exercise 2 months after the industrial complex incident. A simulated close air support scenario had gone wrong when the enemy forces proved more resourceful than expected, pinning down the ground team in a way that wasn't supposed to happen during a training exercise. The exercise controllers were debating whether to pause the scenario and reset when Nakamura's voice came over the radio. Exercise control, this is Ghost. I've got eyes on the situation. Request permission to demonstrate alternate engagement tactics. What followed was a masterclass in close air support that had the exercise observers taking detailed notes. Nakamura systematically neutralized the simulated enemy positions while maintaining constant communication with the ground team, adapting her tactics in real time as the situation evolved. It was exactly the kind of flexible, responsive approach that military planners were trying to incorporate into formal doctrine. After the exercise, Colonel Williams, the base commander, made a point of personally congratulating Nakamura on her performance. "Major," he said, "that was exactly the kind of innovation and tactical excellence we need to see more of." The recognition felt different this time. Not just acknowledgement of rule-breaking in service of a good cause, but professional recognition of genuine expertise and leadership capability. By the time winter arrived, Nakamura had accepted the assignment to the Close Air Support Development Program. The decision hadn't been difficult. The opportunity to help shape how future pilots would provide support to ground forces was exactly the kind of meaningful work she'd always hoped to do. But leaving her current squadron and the pilots she'd come to trust felt like closing an important chapter in her career. Her final mission with the squadron was a routine patrol that turned out to be anything but routine when they received an emergency call from a convoy that had hit an improvised explosive device and was taking small arms fire from multiple directions. This time, however, Nakamura didn't have to make the choice between following orders and helping Americans in danger. This time, she was specifically tasked with providing the close air support that the convoy desperately needed. The engagement lasted 43 minutes and involved 3 different A-10s working in coordination to suppress enemy fire and provide cover for medical evacuation helicopters. Nakamura served as the on-scene commander, coordinating the air assets while maintaining communication with the convoy commander and the incoming medical team. It was complex, multi-dimensional combat that required split-second decision-making and flawless execution. When the last helicopter lifted off with the wounded convoy members, the battlefield fell silent except for the distant sound of A-10 engines circling overhead. The mission had been textbook perfect, no American casualties, enemy forces neutralized, wounded evacuated safely. It was the kind of successful operation that validated years of training and doctrine development. "Excellent work, Ghost," came the voice of the airborne controller. "That was close air support by the book." But as Nakamura flew her final circuit above the now quiet battlefield, she found herself thinking about another engagement months earlier when there had been no book to follow, no authorized mission parameters, and no one to give her permission to do what needed to be done. That day had been about something more fundamental than textbook procedures. It had been about the simple truth that some situations required someone to step forward and take action, regardless of the consequences. Both missions had saved American lives. Both had required skill, courage, and tactical expertise. But only one of them had required the kind of independent judgment and moral courage that defined true leadership. As she turned toward base for the final time as a member of this squadron, Nakamura realized that her unofficial call sign, Ghost, had evolved from a simple description of her flying style into something more significant, a representation of the kind of pilot who appeared when needed most, regardless of official authorization or bureaucratic approval. The Close Air Support Development Program was headquartered at a facility that looked more like a university research center than a military installation. Instead of flight lines and aircraft hangars, there were conference rooms, computer labs, and simulation facilities where pilots, engineers, and tactical analysts worked together to reimagine how air power could more effectively support ground operations. Major Nakamura's first assignment was to serve as the primary pilot representative on a team developing new communication protocols for close air support missions. The existing system worked well when everything went according to plan, but it often broke down when situations became fluid and unpredictable. The goal was to create more flexible procedures that could adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions while still maintaining appropriate safety and authorization controls. The work was intellectually challenging in ways that regular combat flying never was. Instead of responding to immediate tactical situations, she was now thinking about systematic problems and long-term solutions. How could air support be made more responsive without compromising safety? How could individual pilot judgment be incorporated into formal doctrine without creating chaos in command structures? How could the lessons learned from successful operations be captured and transmitted to future pilots? Her experience at the industrial complex became a case study that the team returned to repeatedly. The incident demonstrated both the value of independent pilot judgment and the risks of operating outside established procedures. It provided a real-world example of how tactical situations could evolve faster than formal command structures could respond, and how individual pilots needed the training and authority to make critical decisions under pressure. Dr. Sarah Chen, the program's civilian director and a former Air Force pilot herself, was particularly interested in Nakamura's decision-making process during the unauthorized mission. "Walk me through those moments when you first heard the Marines calling for help," Chen would say during their analytical sessions. "What factors did you consider? How did you weigh the risks against the potential benefits? What would you do differently if you faced a similar situation again?" These conversations forced Nakamura to articulate thought processes that had been largely intuitive during the actual mission, breaking down the decision-making into component parts: threat assessment, capability analysis, risk evaluation, moral considerations, revealed patterns that could potentially be incorporated into pilot training programs. The team's preliminary recommendations included expanded authority for on-scene pilots to provide emergency close air support, improved communication systems that could better convey tactical situations to airborne assets, and enhanced training scenarios that prepared pilots for the kind of independent decision-making that modern combat operations often required. But perhaps the most significant recommendation was cultural rather than procedural. The recognition that exceptional military performance sometimes required thinking beyond established parameters, and that the military needed to better identify and nurture the kind of independent thinking that Nakamura had demonstrated. The program's influence extended beyond close air support doctrine. Military leadership schools began incorporating case studies about situations where following orders and doing the right thing might conflict, and how to prepare officers to navigate those.